one I shall read tonight. As I say, these are both sea-related stories. Is The Saloon Passenger by E. W. Hornung. As the cable was hauled in and the usual cheering passed between tug and ship, Scrimshire unclenched his teeth and gave tongue with a gusto as cynical as it was sincere. It had just come home to him that this was the last link with land, and he beheld it broken with ineffable relief. Tuskar Rock was already a little thing astern. The Australian coast lay the width of the world away. The captain did not expect even to sight any other, and had assured Scrimshire that the average passage was not less than 90 days. So, whatever was to happen in the end, he had 3 months more of life, and of such liberty as a sailing ship affords. He descended to his cabin, locked himself in, and lay down to read what the newspapers had to say about the murder. It seemed strange to Scrimshire that this was the first opportunity he had had of reading up his own crime, but the peculiar circumstances of his departure had forbidden him many a last pleasure ashore, and he was only too glad to have the papers to read now and a stateroom to himself in which to read them. There was a heavy sea running, and Scrimshire was no sailor, but he would not have been without the motion or even its effects upon himself. Both were an incessant reminder that his cabin was not a prison cell, and could not turn into one for 3 months at all events. Besides, he was not the man to surrender to a malady which is largely nervous. So he lay occupied in his berth, medium-sized, dark-skinned, neither young nor middle-aged, only respectably dressed, and with salient jaw unshaven since the thing of which he read without a flicker of the heavy eyelids or a tremor of the hairy hands. He had 5 papers of that morning's date. The crime was worthily reported in them all. 1 or 2 had leaders on its peculiar atrocity. Scrimshire sighed when he came to the end. It was hard that he could see no more papers for 3 months. The egotism of the criminal was excited within him. It was lucky he was no longer on land. He would have run any risk for the evening papers. His very anonymity as author of the tragedy, the thing to which he owed his temporary security, was a certain irritation to him. He was not ashamed of what he had done. It read wonderfully, and was already admitted to have shown that diabolical cleverness and audacity for which Scrimshire alone deserved the credit. Yet it looked as though he would never get it. Thus far, at least, it was plain that there was not a shred of evidence against him, or against any person upon earth. He sighed again, smiled at himself for sighing, and, closing his eyes for the first time since the murder, slept like a baby for several hours. Scrimshire was the only passenger in the saloon, of which he presently became the life and soul. At the first meal he yielded to the temptation of a casual allusion to the murder on the Caledonian Railway, but though they had heard of it, neither captain nor officers showed much interest in the subject, which Scrimshire dropped with a show of equal indifference. And this was his last weakness of the kind. He threw his newspapers overboard, and conquered the morbid vanity they had inspired by a superb effort of the will. Remorse he had none, and for 3 months certain he was absolutely safe. So he determined to enjoy himself meanwhile, and in doing so, being a dominant personality, he managed to diffuse considerable enjoyment throughout the ship. This man was not a gentleman in either the widest or the narrowest sense of that invidious term. He wore cheap jewellery, cheap tweeds as yellow as his boots, paper collars, and shirts of a brilliant blue. He spoke with a Cockney intonation, which, in a Scottish vessel, grated more or less upon every ear. but he had funds of information and of anecdote as inexhaustible as his energy and as entertaining as his rough good humour. He took a lively interest in every incident of the voyage, and was as ready to go aloft in a gale of wind as to make up a rubber in any part of the ship. Within a month he was equally popular in the forecastle, the steerage, and the captain's cabin. Then one morning Scrimshire awoke with a sense that something unusual was happening, followed by an instantaneous premonition of impending peril to himself. There were too many boots and voices over his head. The ship was bowling sedately before the north-east trades, and otherwise as still as a ship could be. Scrimshire sat up and looked through his porthole. A liner was passing them, also outward bound, and some 3 or 4 miles to port. There was nothing alarming in that. Yet Scrimshire went straight on deck in his pyjamas, and on the top rung of the poop ladder paused an instant, his now bearded jaw more salient than it had been for weeks. 4 little flags fluttered one above the other from the peak halyards, and at the weather rail stood the captain, a powerful figure of a man, with his long legs planted well apart and a marine binocular glued to his eyes. Near him was the second mate, a simple young fellow, who greeted Scrimshire with a nod. "What's up, McKendrick? What is she?" "A Castle liner, one of Donald Curry's Cape boats." "Why'd you signal her?" whispered Scrimshire. "'Twas she signalled us." "Do you know what it's all about?" "No, but the captain does." The captain turned round as they were speaking, and Scrimshire read his secret at a glance. It was his own, discovered since his flight and flashed across the sea by the liner's pennons. Meanwhile the captain was looking him up and down, his hitherto friendly face convulsed with hatred and horror, and Scrimshire realised the instant necessity of appearing absolutely unsuspicious of suspicion. "Morning, Captain," said he, with all the cheerful familiarity which already existed between them. "And what's all this bloomin' signalling about?" "Want to know?" thundered the captain, now looking him through and through. "You bet I do." And Scrimshire held his breath upon an insinuating grin, parrying plain abhorrence with seeming unconcern, until the other merely stared. "Then you can mind your own business," roared the captain at last, "and get off my poop, and speak to my officer of the watch again at your peril." "Well, I'm hanged," drawled Scrimshire, and turned on his heel with the raised eyebrows of bewildered innocence. But the drops stood thick upon his forehead when he saw himself next minute in his stateroom mirror. So, he was found out, and the captain had been informed he had a murderer aboard, and detectives would meet the ship in Hobson's Bay, and the murderer would be escorted back through the Suez Canal and duly hanged, after nothing better than a run round the world for his money. The thing had happened before. It had been the fate of the first train murderer, but he had taken the wrong hat in his panic. What on earth had Scrimshire left behind him that was going to hang him after all? He could not think, nor was that the thing to think about. The immediate necessity he had seen at once, with extraordinary quickness of perception, and he had already acted upon it with a nerve more extraordinary still. He must preserve such a front as should betray not the shadow of a dream that he could by any possibility be suspected by any soul on board. Absolute ease must be his watchword, absolute security his pose. Then they might like to save themselves the inconvenience of keeping him in irons, knowing that detectives would be waiting to do all the dirty work at the other end. And in 2 months' thinking, a man should hit upon something, or he deserved to swing. The opening day was not the worst. The captain's rudeness was enough to account for a change in any man's manner, and Scrimshire did both well and naturally to sulk for the remainder of that day. His unusual silence gave him unusual opportunities for secret observation, and he was thankful indeed that for the time being there was no necessity to live up to his popular reputation. The scene of the morning was all over the ship, yet so far as the saloon passenger could see, the captain had not told anybody as yet. The chief mate invited him into his cabin for a smoke, spread the usual newspaper for a spittoon, and spun the inevitable yarns. But then the chief was a hard-bitten old dog with nerves of iron and a face of brass. He might know everything or nothing at all. It was for Scrimshire to adapt his manner to the first hypothesis, and to impress the mate with the exuberance of his spirits and the utter lightness of his heart. Later in the morning he had some conversation with the second officer. It was but a word, and yet it confirmed the culprit in his conviction about the signals. "What have I done," he asked McKendrick, "to make the old man jump down my throat like that?" "It wasn't you," replied the second. "It was the signals. But you might have known not to bother him with questions just then." "But what the deuce were the signals about?" "That's more than I ken, Bennett." This was Scrimshire's alias on board. "Can't you find out?" "Maybe I might, after a bit." "Why not now?" "The old man's got the book in his cabin, the dictionary book about the signalling, you ken. It's my place to keep yon, but the old man's carried it off, and there's not another in the ship." "Aha!" "Oh, aye, it was something for hissel, nae doot, but none of us kens what, and no we ever will, for he's close as tar is the old man." The old man was in point of fact no older than Scrimshire, but he had worked his way aft from ship's boy, and a cruel boyhood followed by an early command had aged and hardened him. A fine seaman, and a firm though fiery commander, Captain Nielsen had also as kind a heart as one could wish to win, and a mind as simple as it was fair. It was on these qualities that Scrimshire determined to play as he sulked in his deck-chair on the poop of the four-masted bark Lochwinoch, while the captain thumped up and down in his rubber soles, his face black with thought, and a baleful eye upon the picture of offended oblivion behind the novel in the chair. It was an interesting contest that was beginning between this pair, both of whom were strong, determined, wilful men, but one was as cunning as the other was kind, and he not only read his better like a book, but supplied in his turn a very legible and entirely plausible reading of himself. He never dreamt of impressing the captain as an innocent man. That would entail an alteration of pose inconsistent with the attitude of one who entertained no tittle of suspicion that the morning's signalling had been about himself. On the contrary, what he had really been, and what he must now doubly appear, was the guilty man who had very little fear of ever being detected, and not the fleeting shadow of a notion that such detection had already taken place. This was the obvious and the only role. He had played it instinctively thus far, and need only go on as he had begun. The reward was at best precarious. It depended entirely upon the character and temperament of Captain Nielsen. Scrimshire credited him with sufficient strength and sufficient humanity to do nothing, and to tell nobody until the Australian detectives came aboard. But that remained to be proved. Nielsen might leave him a free man all the voyage, and yet put him in irons before the very end. It would be kinder to do so at once. However, he should not do so at all if Scrimshire could help it, and he was not long in letting fall an oblique and delicate, though an excessively audacious hint upon the responsibility of such a course in his own particular case. It was at the midday meal, while the smoke of the accursed liner was still a dirty cloud on the horizon. Nielsen remained morose and silent, while the offended passenger would not give him word or look, but, on the other hand, talked more than ever, and with invidious gaiety, to the first and second officers. The captain glowered at his plate, searching his transparent soul for the ideal course, and catching very little of the conversation. How the topic of suicide arose, he never knew. "And I call it the act of a coward," young McKendrick was declaring. "You can say what you like, but a man's not a man that does the like of that." "Well, you think about it next time you're having a shave, old man," retorted Scrimshire pleasantly. "Think of burying a razor in your neck, and the pain, and the blood coming over your fingers like as though you turned on the hot tap. And if you think long enough, you'll know whether it's the act of a coward or whether it ain't." "I'll blow my blessed head in," said the chief officer. "It'd be quicker." "Oh, if it comes to that," said Scrimshire, "I'd take prussic acid for choice. It would take a lot to make me, I admit, but I'd do it like a shot to escape a worse death. I've often thought, for instance, what a rum thing it is in these days that a man of any sense or education whatever should let himself live to be hung." The captain looked up at this. So far he had merely listened. But Scrimshire was addressing himself to the chief mate at the other end of the table. Neither look nor tone was intended to include Captain Nielsen, the one being averted and the other lowered to a nice degree of insolent disregard. On the other hand, the manner of this theoretical suicide was all audacity and nonchalance, combined with a certain underlying sincerity which gave it a peculiar value in the mind of one listener. In a word, it was the manner of a man so convinced of his own security as to afford the luxury of telling the truth about himself in jest. "They don't give you a chance," said the mate. "They watch you night and day. You'd be a good man once you got to dance the hornpipe on nothing if you went out any other way." "Nevertheless, I'd do it," said Scrimshire with cheery confidence. "I back myself to do it, and before their eyes." "Poison?" "Yes." "In a ring, eh?" "A ring? Do you suppose they'd leave you your rings? No, it might be in a hollow tooth, and it might not. All I say is that I back myself to cheat the hangman." Scrimshire said it through his black moustache. "And I'd do it too," he added after a pause. Then at last the captain put in his word. "You would do well," he said quietly. "I once saw a man swing, and I never want to see another. Ugh." His eyes met Scrimshire's, which fell deliberately, and the talkative tongue wagged no more that meal. Thereafter Nielsen was civility itself, only observant civility. He had made up his mind in the knotty matter of the suspected murderer, and the latter read his determination as he had read the difficulty which it solved, if only for the present. "So he means to let me go loose, only keeping an eye on me. So far, so good. But how long? How long? If I thought he was going to put me in irons as soon as he sights the land—" He looked over the side, and a slight shudder shook even his frame. It was very blue water now, the depth unfathomable. A shark had been seen that morning. And, shark or no sharks, Scrimshire could not swim. But he had 2 months of steady thought before him. Meanwhile, the captain showed some cunning in his turn. He evidently wished to convince himself that Scrimshire had not suspected the signalling. One day, at any rate, the passenger was invited into the captain's cabin in quite the old friendly fashion, for a pipe and a chat, in the middle of which Nielsen left him for 5 minutes to speak to the officer of the watch. As the northeast trades blew as strong and true as ever, as the yards had not been touched for days, and no sail was in sight, Scrimshire scented a trap, and presently beheld one set under his nose in the shape of the signalling book. Scrimshire smiled. The captain found him buried in a magazine, and his little trap untouched. And the obvious deduction was also final to the sailor's mind. 6 weeks produced no change in the outward 6 weeks produced no change in the outward situation, but brought the voyage so near its end that every soul but one waxed merry with the thought of shore, and that one seemed the merriest of them all. They had come from the longitude of the Cape to that of Kangaroo Island in 20 days, and in all probability would enter Port Phillip Heads in 2 days more. In 1 week the Loch Vinnoch had logged upon 2,000 miles, boy and man. Her commander had never made such an easting in his sea-going life. His pleasure and his pride were alike enormous, and Scrimshire conceived that his general goodwill towards men could scarcely have suffered by the experience. He determined, at all events, to feel his way to such compassion as an honest man could be expected to extend towards an unhung murderer, and he felt it with that mixture of cautious craft and sheer impudence which made him the formidable criminal he was. It was the night that might prove the last of the voyage, and the last night of freedom for the unhappy Scrimshire. Unhappy he undoubtedly was, for the strain of continuing as he had begun, the life and soul of the ship, had told upon even his nerves in the end, though to the end it had been splendidly borne. Tonight, however, as he paced the poop by the captain's side, he exhibited for the first time a despondency which exactly fitted with Nielsen's conception of his case. "I shall never forget this voyage," said Scrimshire, sighing. "I shall never forget this voyage," said Scrimshire, sighing. "You may not believe me, Captain, but I'm sorry it's over. I am, indeed. No doubt I'm the only man in the ship who is." "And why are you?" asked Nielsen, eyeing his passenger for once with the curiosity which had so long consumed him, as also with the sympathy which had grown upon him, despite, or on account of, those sinister signals from the castle liner. Scrimshire shrugged. "Oh, that's a long story. I've had a rum life of it, and not what you would call the life of a saint. This voyage will stand out as one of its happiest chapters, that's all, and it may be one of the last." "Why do you say that?" "Oh, one can never tell." "But what did you think of doing out there?" "God knows." Nielsen was miserable. There was a ring in the hoarse voice that went straight to his heart. He longed to tell this man what was in store for him, what he himself knew, but he conquered the longing as he had conquered it before. Time enough when the detectives came on board. Dirty work and all responsibility would very well keep for them. So the good captain thought to himself as the pair took turns in silence. So the dominant brain at his side willed and intended that he should think. "Whatever you hear of me," resumed Scrimshire at last, "and however great a beast I may some day turn out, remember that I wasn't one aboard your ship. Will you, Captain? Remember the best of me, and I'll be grateful, whatever I am and whatever happens." "I will," said Nielsen, hoarse in his turn, and he grasped the guilty hand. Scrimshire had some ado to keep from smiling, but there was another point upon which he required an assurance, and he sought it after a decent pause. "So you expect to pass the Otway some time tomorrow?" "By dinner time, if we're lucky." "And there you signal?" Yes, they should hear of us in Melbourne early tomorrow afternoon. And what about the pilot? Oh, he'll come aboard later. Certainly not before evening. It's easy as mid-ocean till you come to the heads, and we can't be there before nightfall, even if the wind holds fair. Well, let's hope it may. So long, Captain, and 1,000 thanks for all your kindness. Dark night, by the way. Yes, let's hope tomorrow won't be like it. But the next night was darker still. There was neither moon nor star, and Scrimshire was thankful to have had speech with the captain while he could, for now he would speak to nobody, and tomorrow... There was no tomorrow in Scrimshire's mind. There was only tonight. There was the hour he had been living for these 6 long weeks. There was the plan that had come to him with the southeast trades and rolled in his mind through the Southern Ocean, only to reach perfection within the last few hours. But it was perfect now, and all beyond lay dark. "Isn't that their boat, sir?" It was the chief steward who wanted to know. He was dallying on the poop in the excitement of the occasion. The captain stood farther aft. An anxious face, a red cigar end, and the blue tam o' were all of him that showed in the intense darkness. The mainyard had just been backed, and the chief officer was now on the quarterdeck, seeing the rope ladder over the side. It was through his glasses that Scrimshire was watching the pilot's cutter, or rather her lights, and as well as he could by their meagre rays, the little boat that now bobbed against the cutter's side. "It is the boat, ain't it, sir?" persisted the steward. "Yes, I think so," said Scrimshire. "How many men come with the pilot as a rule?" "Only himself and a chap to row him." You might give these to the chief officer, steward. I'm going to my cabin for a minute. Don't forget to thank the mate for lending me his glasses. They've been exceedingly useful to me." And Scrimshire disappeared down the ladder. His tone had been strange, but the steward only remembered this afterwards. At the time he was too excited himself, and too glad of a glass to level at the boat, to note any such nicety as a mere tone. "4 of them, by Jove," mused the steward. "I wonder what that's for." But he did not wonder long. In a very few minutes the 4 were on board, and ascending the same ladder by which Scrimshire had gone below, the pilot at their head. Nielsen received them at the break of the poop. "I congratulate you, Captain," was the pilot's greeting. "We didn't expect you before next week. Now, first, allow me," and he lowered his voice, "to introduce Inspector Robbins of the Melbourne Police. This gentleman is an officer he has brought with him, and my man has come aboard for a message for the shore. Mr. Robbins would like a word with you before we let him go. There is no hurry, for I am very much afraid I can't take you until till daylight." Nielsen took the inspector to the weather rail. "I know what's coming," he said. "The Garth Castle's signalled." I know. Have you got him? Have you got him?" rapped out Robbins. "Safe and sound," whispered the captain, "and thinks himself as right as the bank, poor devil." "Then you didn't put him in irons?" "No, I thought it better not to. He'd have committed suicide." "I spotted that. Sounded him without his knowing," said the crafty captain. "I happened to read the signals myself, and I never let on to a soul in the ship." The good fellow looked delighted with himself behind his red cigar, but the acute face of the detective scarcely reflected his satisfaction. "Well, that's all right, if he's all right," said Robbins. "If you don't mind, Captain, I'd like to be introduced to him. One or both of us will spend the night with him, by your leave." "As you like," said Nielsen, "but I can't help feeling sorry for him. He's no more idea of this than the man in the moon. That you, steward? Where's Mr. Bennet? He was here a minute ago. Yes, sir. Only just gone below, sir. Well, go and ask him to come up and drink with the pilot. I'll introduce him to the pilot, and you can do what you like," continued the captain, only wishing he could shirk a detestable duty altogether. "But I give you fair warning. This is a desperate man, or I'm much mistaken in him." "Desperate?" chuckled the inspector. "Don't we know it? It seems to have been as bad a murder as you've had in the old country for a long time. In a train, all planned. Victim in one carriage, our friend in the next. Got along footboard in tunnel, shot him dead through window and got back. Case of revenge. And other fellow no beauty, but this one's got to swing. On his way to join your ship too. Passage booked beforehand. The most cold-blooded plant—" It was the chief steward, breathless and panic-stricken. "His door's locked." "He always does lock it," exclaimed the captain, as Robbins darted to the ladder with an oath. "But now he won't answer," cried the steward. And even with his words the answer came, in the terrific report of a revolver fired in a confined space. Next instant the inspector had hurled himself into the little saloon, the others at his heels, and half the ship's company at theirs. There was no need to point out the culprit's cabin. White smoke was streaming through the ventilated panels. All stood watching it, but for a time no one spoke. Then Robbins turned upon the captain. "We have you to thank for this, Captain Nielsen," said he. "It is you who will have to answer for it." Nielsen turned white, but it was white heat with him. "And so I will," he thundered, "but not to you. I don't answer to any confounded colonial policeman, and I don't take cheek from one either. By heavens, sir, I'm master of this ship, and for 2 pins I'll have you over the side again, detective or no detective. Do your business and break in that door, and you leave me to mind mine at the proper time and in the proper place." He was furious with the fury of a masterful mariner, whose word is law aboard his own vessel. And yet, beneath this virile passion, there lurked a certain secret satisfaction in the thought that the companion of so many weeks was at all events not to hang. But the tragedy which had occurred was a greater unpleasantness for himself. Indeed, it might well lead to something more, and Nielsen stood in the grip of grim considerations in his own doorway, while Robbins sent for the carpenter without addressing another syllable to the captain. The saloon had been invaded by steerage passengers, and even by members of the crew, but discipline was for once a secondary matter in the eyes of Captain Nielsen, and their fire was all for the insolent intruder who had dared to blame him aboard his own ship. The carpenter had to fight his way through a small but exceedingly dense crowd, beginning on the quarterdeck outside, and at its thickest in the narrow passage terminating in the saloon. On his arrival, however, the lock was soon forced, and the door swung inwards in a sudden silence, broken as suddenly by the detective's voice. "Empty! By heaven!" he shrieked. "Hunt him! He's given us the slip!" And the saloon emptied only less rapidly than it had filled, till Nielsen had it to himself. He stepped over to the passenger's cabin, half expecting to find him hiding in some corner after all. There he was wrong. Nor did he at once grasp the full significance of what he did find. A revolver was dangling from a peg on one side of the cabin, dangling by a yard of twine secured to the trigger. A few more inches of the twine, tied to the butt, had been severed by burning, as had another yard dangling from another peg at the opposite side of the cabin. An inch of candle lay upon the floor. The twine had been passed through it. There was its mark in the wax. The whole had been strung across the cabin, and the candle lighted before Scrimshire left. The revolver, hung by the trigger as a man is hanged by the neck, had been given a 3-foot drop and gone off duly as the flame burnt down to the string. Such was the plan which an ingenious if perverted mind had taken several weeks to perfect. Nielsen rushed on deck to find all hands at the rail and a fresh sensation in the air. The pilot met him on the poop. "My boat's gone," he cried, "and the night like pitch." Nielsen stood thunderstruck. "Did you leave a man aboard?" "No, he came up for a telegram for the police in town." "Then you can't blame me there." And the captain leapt upon the rail at the break of the poop. "Silence!" he roared. "Silence, every man of you! If we can't see, we must listen. That's it. Not a whisper. Now." At first there was nothing to be heard but the quick-drawn breath from 100 throats. Then, out of the impenetrable darkness, came the thud, thud, thud of an oar in a rowlock, already some distance away, but in which direction it was impossible to tell on such a night. The end. Yep. I mean, let's not root for murderers, but that was a very clever plan. Whether he got caught, we won't know. Probably not. He probably escaped. But yeah, clever. Clever girl. No. Also, yes, when reading that through, I realised that one of the members of the crew is Scottish, and then Scrimshire himself is explicitly said to be Cockney, and then forgot. So reading, because I read through this a few days ago, and then rereading it now, I was like, oh yeah, I have to do accents. Oh god. So yes, they missed the last chapter off. No. But yeah, I thought that was a good one. That was fun. We've yes, got a couple of murders today. Because the second story is possibly murdery. Well, murdery. But yes, I hope you all enjoyed that. That was I rather enjoyed that. In Minecraft. What? Oh, we're doing the whole, yeah. Sam must explain that joke because I can't be bothered. Who disappeared? Excuse me. Oh, late Mephistopheles disappeared. Well, if you're watching the VOD, I hope you had a good night. And yes, I hope the thunder was thunder and not cats. Sam? I would be quite impressed if the cats managed to cause enough havoc that you could hear low rumbles from outside. It's thunder, but lots. Nice. Thunder or explosions. Let's hope for thunder. Yes. But anyway, I shall go and make a cup of tea. So you all go have a nice break. Do break-related things. And we will see you back in about 5 minutes. Bye for now. are back. Welcome back. I hope everybody has had a good break and has made some form of tea or, I don't know, hot beverage or snack or something. I don't know. Also, hello Ray Tracer. Thank you very much for resubscribing. I hope you are well. Duolingo, nice. You have appeased the owl. Yes, I hope everybody is doing well and having a nice chill time. Also, chilliterate people, I like that. Chilliterati or there was one Sam came up with. I've forgotten what it was. I'm sure he will remember. He might not. But yes. So I think I'll probably Chilluminati. That was that. It wasn't this. Yes, it was. There was Chilliterati or the Chilluminati, I think. I was like, oh my goodness me, everybody's subscribing. Thank you so much. You're wonderful people. Thank you very much, The Hat 21. Very kind of you indeed to resubscribe. Thank you. Lightning indoors and out. Yeah, you sound like you're having a great time with the thunderstorm at yours. It is decidedly not even rainy here. Not quite tea, but you've been simmering henna and the kitchen smells terrible now. Oh dear. Well, I hope whatever you're using it for turns out great. And I hope the smell goes away a bit. Chilluminati, another cult you're going to have to join. Not a cult. Definitely not a cult. Also, hello Andy. I didn't even notice you appeared. Hope you are well. I said that really weirdly. Hope you are well. It's really lovely to see everyone tonight. That tea's far too hot. But yes, I hope we are all doing splendidly. Very well, thanks. Good. I'm very glad. But right. So I thought that I would probably only read 2 stories tonight, just because I'm quite tired. But yes, this story here, as I said earlier, and for those of you who weren't around then, this is a story by an author called Anna McMullen, on whom I can find very little. I can't find when she died, I can't find when she was born, I can't find any other writings of hers except this short story. So I'm going to chance reading this. It may well be that she is still within copyright, in which case... First author. No, second author. First author was E.W. Hornung, who is fine, he's out of copyright. But yes, I don't know anything about her, but I thought because she is a female author, I should read it, because we don't read enough women authors, because there aren't enough classic books that have been published because women wrote them, or at least those not under pen names. So apologise for the misinformation earlier in chat. Oh, did you accidentally did you say something about him? Yes, yeah. The first one was a chap, E.W. Hornung. So this one is about. This one is by Anna McMullen. First one was the woman. No. First one. Sorry, I should have clarified it a little bit better. I think I did mention that it was Anna McMullen is the author that we don't know much about. But yes, this is this one. You keep missing these streams, so glad you could finally catch one. Well, I'm very glad you could as well. But life gets in the way, you know. It's absolutely fine to miss streams. We don't mind. I hope that things have been good. You weren't paying attention. Fair enough. You were also finishing up work, so that's sort of fair. But yes, this is another sea-related story, and it is called The Fair Exchange by Anna McMullen. I've never before realised what it means to me. Even the familiar things, the murmur of talk in the bar downstairs, the hum of conversation from the groups of people on the hard, all those commonplace sounds I am hearing now. And behind them all, the sea, slapping softly at the boats as the rising tide creeps up the mud. Ever since I can remember, I have found here everything that is necessary for my life. This place has been all sufficient. The sea, so vast and yet so small and intimate where it gurgles in the little creeks among the saltings. The saltings, so grey and dun, and then so beautiful when they are purple with sea lavender in the summer and green with the queer transparent samphire. Even the mud can be lovely at low tide, with lights and shades and the different greens of the seaweeds that grow on the harder parts. And the winds, the east wind that brings the pure sea smell, a deep sea smell, and raises white horses up the river, and the southwest wind that brings the mud smell at low tide, a mixed smell of flowers and hedgerows, and a warm smell of cattle on the marshes. Winter and summer it changes, but I love it. I have seen it on November evenings, very grey and colourless, and very still, the water like a mirror, hazy with mist, the marshes lying low and quiet. A flock of great saddleback gulls standing motionless on the mud, the silence only broken as one or another of them flies up with a flapping of wings and a harsh cry. And on cold, frosty mornings, the water blue and dancing in the sunlight, and flocks of oxbird wheeling and turning in the clear sky, flashing silver as they turn their white undersides to the sun, the saltings sparkling with frost, the fleets on the marshes frozen hard enough for skating. But I can never make anyone understand what all this means to me. Except Peter. I think Peter would understand. With Peter I have never felt the need to explain. From the days when we used to wade after flounders up the creeks at low tide, feeling with our hands along the rill of water at the bottom, then catching them and throwing them up on the mud. When the tide began to flow, we would tramp along the mud to collect them and stow them in Peter's canvas dinghy. I remember how our bare legs looked like long black stockings, and how we used to cut our feet on oyster shells. Those days are still so vivid to me, the freedom and the timelessness. In fact, the only sort of time that mattered at all was the ebb and flow of the tides. Taking sandwiches, we would go out all day on the old barn marsh, walking till we were tired and hungry, then bathing in the creek over the sea wall. After that we would eat our sandwiches, then lie on our backs in the sweet marsh grass, watching a heron flap slowly across the vast sky that stretches enormously from low horizon to horizon. And then we'd go to Halfpenny Fleet and creep up to the decoy to see how many duck we could surprise in it. Or we'd take the dinghy and explore new unknown creeks, following them right up to the end. Sometimes the tide would fall, leaving us stranded on the mud, with no choice but to get out and push the dinghy or wait until the water returned. And sometimes the creeks became so narrow at the end that we were squeezed between the banks of the saltings. That was before Peter's father built me the Fair Exchanged, cutter-rigged, 18 feet long, and not very beautiful, but comfortable and easy to handle. He said she was only a fair exchange for my amusing Peter during his holidays. After that, we could explore the larger and more distant creeks, could sail across the estuary to villages on the other side. And then, later still, I could sail the Fair Exchange in the club races, with Peter as crew. Now I can hear Joe clearing the bar and Father's voice saying good night. I can hear other voices getting louder as they pass into the road, but tonight they are not so loud and cheerful as usual. I cannot believe there might have come a time when all this would have gone on without me, when I could no longer have sat up here in my room at night, looking over the dark water, watching the yacht's lights and their shimmering reflections. If I put my head out of the window, I can see the few lights of the derelict tramp steamers lying up the river. Through the window comes the smell of the sea, and now and then a wailing cry from a redshank on the marshes. Footsteps and voices are dying away now, some up the road and some down to the Hard. In a minute or two, Father will be coming upstairs. He will be very kind and tender. He has always been kind and tender, ever since my mother died and he retired from the Navy. So simple in his kindness, just as he is simple in his pride at being an innkeeper. He was so pleased and proud when I became engaged to Ralph. He'd always wanted me to be mistress of a comfortable home, of luxuries and possessions that he could never give me, and that I have never wanted. And he had always been afraid that I should marry Peter. Not that he wasn't fond of him, but Peter was only the son of a boat builder. Poor Peter. It was a Saturday when Ralph first came, one of those soft, warm days we sometimes get in very early spring. I remember Peter and I had the Fair Exchange up on the Hard and were scraping and painting her. Ralph's friends had arranged for him to put up with us at the Lord Nelson. I remember Father coming down to see how we were getting on, and telling us that an elder brother of Ralph's had served under him in the Navy. Ralph came down fairly often after that, and most weekends his big grey car was in our garage. It is there now, I suppose. He seemed to enjoy coming, and was at first anxious for me to teach him to sail and to take him out in the Fair Exchange. By the end of May we were engaged, and to this day I don't know how it happened. I remember it only as part of the evening, for in itself it never seemed to make a real impression on me. Father had been out of sorts all the week, depressed and anxious because business was slack, and I was worried about him. Ralph arrived in high spirits, and Father seemed to cheer up at once. Somehow the sight of his big body with its strength and assurance relieved my worry. I was glad to listen to his jokes and talk at dinner. After dinner, Ralph and I walked down the coast road to the old tarred wooden houses and ship stores, then onto the sea wall that runs up the creek. The evening was warm and still. The thorn trees on Hay Island stood out black against a clear, green-blue sky. The tide was ebbing, the mud glimmering in the fading light. After walking along a little, we sat down on a derelict boat, upturned against the sea wall. I think the beauty of the evening had stilled even Ralph's tongue. The silence was broken only by the gentle sucking noises the water makes as it runs out of the little creeks and holes in the saltings. Ralph turned to speak to me, and I laid a finger on his rather full lips. I had always wanted to do that. And then I was in his arms. It was as if all my worry and tiredness were flowing away with the tide, leaving a sense of renewed strength that was yet peaceful and secure. I don't remember feeling very different afterwards or thinking much about it. Life went on as usual, and Father's health improved. He was in good spirits and especially affectionate to me. During the week I did my usual jobs about the house, bathed and walked and sailed the Fair Exchange. The only difference was that I didn't see so much of Peter. I used to look forward to the weekends, to the strange, sweet excitement of being taken in Ralph's arms and kissed. I enjoyed taking him for walks and out in the Fair Exchange and trying to show him the ropes. But he never had any sea sense. At first I think he genuinely tried to be interested and to like the things I liked. But he didn't like mud, and he didn't like getting wet and not having his meals at regular times. I think he was soon impatient of my preoccupation with it all, and would try to make me discuss the wedding and the house he was building for me. He liked to make me go out in the car with him instead of sailing. And yet he had only to touch me, and I forgot all those things and would do as he liked. Ralph came down last night. For the first time I was glad when he let me go. I don't know whether it was the faint smell of petrol on his clothes, or the strength with which he held me. He seemed so benevolently possessive. At dinner he began to plan a long drive for today. Father said it was a good idea, and would be a change for me. Somehow the fact of their both being in agreement made me resentful. I said it looked so fine that it would be a good opportunity to take Ralph for a long sail. He didn't like the idea, and was inclined to argue, but I had my way. It is strange to think that it was only this morning we started out. It seems like something that happened a long time ago, or like a violent storm that has now drifted away. The day was so fine when I woke this morning that I never gave Ralph a thought. It was a lovely day, and we were going sailing. I was up early so that I could get my jobs done in good time and the food basket ready. As I worked, I whistled. Even Ralph seemed cheerful and tried to help me in his clumsy way. We started down to the Hard, Ralph in his clean white flannels carrying the lunch basket, and I carrying the oars and rowlocks for the dinghy, for since my new brass ones disappeared I have always brought the rowlocks up at night. I reckoned it would be high tide about 1:15, and I wondered whether last night I had left the dinghy anchor high enough up the beach to get it without wading. I found the anchor without any trouble, and pulled the dinghy in against the stone part of the Hard so that Ralph and the lunch could embark without getting muddy. Then I pulled out from among the huddle of boats and rowed to the Fair Exchange, rocking gently at her moorings in the middle of the creek. I brought the dinghy alongside and went aboard so that I could take the lunch basket from Ralph and make the dinghy fast. Ralph came aboard heavily, as he usually does, making both boats rock. I made him undo the tiers round the mainsail while I got the jib ready for hoisting. Then I gave him the tiller and told him to keep her head to the wind and the mainsheet clear while I hoisted the sails. I went forward and cast off from the buoy, ran back and took the tiller from Ralph, took in the jib sheet and the mainsheet, and we were off, leaving the dinghy on the mooring. We had a soldier's wind down the creek. It was fair nearly all the way across the estuary to Stonewell, except for a short beat up Stonewell Creek. Soon I forgot about Ralph. The boat was like a live thing under my hands, quivering as she forged ahead, the water slapping under her bow and the wind thrumming through the stays. The smell of the sea was in my nostrils and the wind in my hair. It was about 12:30 when we sailed up the creek to Stonewell and brought up at the little tumble-down jetty, making fast to one of the wooden piles. I let down the sails, and we left the Fair Exchange snug and tidy and went ashore. As we walked along the grass lane to the leather bottle to buy beer, the sounds and smells were all of the country instead of the sea. The humming of insects and bees, the song of larks, and the smell of dusty roads and cow dung. We ate our lunch and drank our beer in the shade of a haystack. It was soft and comfortable in the sweet-smelling hay, and I think I must have dozed for a moment after lunch, because when I closed my eyes Ralph was lighting a cigarette, and when I next opened them he was stubbing it out on the sole of his shoe. We got up and shook the hay out of our clothes and walked back to the jetty. The spring tide was at its height, the saltings covered, with only a tuft of coarse grass here and there standing up out of the water, which had risen right up to the sea walls. Ralph took my hand in his, and we stood looking over the water. I remember Ralph asked me about some gulls that got up and flew along the creek, and I told him they were cob gulls, which get their black heads from March to September, so the fishermen say, by dipping them in March water. The tide turned while we were standing there, and I noticed that the sky had clouded over and the sun gone in. The wind that had freshened blew rather chilly, and we decided to set off. We went aboard the Fair Exchange, ran up the sails, and got under way. As we came out of the creek into the estuary, the wind was against the tide and the sea quite rough. The Fair Exchange put her nose into it once or twice, sending a shower of water over us. We sailed for home. I suppose if I'd not decided to turn and run up West Creek, it might never have happened. But the Fair Exchange goes so well in a strong breeze. It was still early, and I'd caught sight of Peter's sail round the bend in the creek. Ralph wasn't very wet, but he hated the taste of salt on his lips. For some reason he was always afraid of jibing, so to save his feelings I wended round, and we set off up the creek after Peter. The tide was racing out of West Creek against the wind, and even there it was choppy. We were running by the lee, and I knew we should have to jibe at the bend, so I warned Ralph. He asked why couldn't we wend, and I explained there wasn't room. There was a pretty strong gust of wind as we came to the bend. I said, "Beware jibe," to Ralph, put up the helm, and started to gather in the mainsheet. About what happened then, I shall never know. I suppose Ralph either fouled the mainsheet accidentally or seized it in a panic. At the time, all I knew was that we were over, the sail flat in the water, and I was automatically bracing my feet against the gunwale, trying to stop any loose gear going overboard. Then I was aware of Ralph's feet scrabbling violently on the bottom boards as he tried to climb up to the top side of the overturned boat. "Hurry up and get there, Ralph," I said. "You'll have the bottom boards out in a minute." I glanced down the creek and saw Peter about 3 minutes away. He waved his arm to us, and I waved back. The Fair Exchange was getting lower in the water. I said to Ralph, "You better abandon ship and swim ashore, or potter about until Peter picks you up." But he sat on, his face looking rather white. "Hurry up, Ralph, do," I said. "Your weight is sinking her." He would not let go. I said again, "Your weight is sinking her. What are you waiting for?" But he still clung on. Suddenly the look of panic in his eyes infuriated me. If he stayed there much longer, he'd sink the boat. He'd only just got to drop into the water and swim about till Peter came, but there he sat like a great stuffed dummy, white and shivering. "Go on, you fool," I said, and gave him a push. He went into the water. It was when I saw the look on his face and heard his frantic splashings that I first realised he couldn't swim. For a second or two I hesitated, amazed. Before I was in the water, the race had caught him and was sweeping him out of my reach. When I had cleared the hair and water from my eyes, I saw Peter dive in and seize him. Ralph was struggling furiously, and as Peter first caught hold of him, they both went under. When they came up again, they were farther from me, and as the tide hurried them along, I heard Peter calling. I swam with every ounce of energy I possessed, my lungs bursting, my clothes sodden and heavy. I can feel the ache in my limbs now. But I couldn't get near them, though I could see that Ralph had got Peter round the neck and was hanging on. I tried to shout, but my mouth was full of water and my hair was getting in my eyes. For a moment I thought I heard the chug-chug of a motorboat, but soon that was drowned by the sound of water roaring in my ears. The next thing I felt, as if to reassure me, was the familiar sensation of a boat under way. I was lying on the deck of a smack, while a fisherman tried to pour something down my throat. For a little I lay still, trying to remember. Then I remembered. I looked at his face, and I knew they were gone. I lay still and watched the top of the mast swaying against the sky. I listened to the throb of the engine and the wash of the dinghy astern. Overhead the gulls circled and screamed. It was on the mud they found them, at low tide, their bodies locked together. There was mud in their eyes and ears when they brought them ashore 2 hours ago. The mud that, to Peter and me, has always been a friendly and familiar sort of joke. But Ralph, he would have hated to be found like that. He hated the mud, the way it oozes round your bare feet in the water, the way it sticks and clings and spreads to everything you touch. Now I can hear Father shutting and bolting the door. Soon he will be coming upstairs. I shall see the pain and bewilderment in his eyes. He will be appalled at the idea of my grief. He will be kind and very gentle, thinking I am numbed with shock, fearing the moment when the full realization of my grief will come. But I can feel no grief, and I believe no grief will come. Perhaps I am utterly heartless. Perhaps in my soul I have committed murder. But now suddenly all things are plain and clear. They are both gone. Ralph, whom I desired, and at the last moment hated, and Peter, who was a part of all those things I love. But those other things have been returned to me, and now they will never be taken from me. To me, it seems a fair exchange. The only thing I can't understand is how I ever came to be in such danger. I mean, the danger of marrying Ralph, of going away and losing everything. Father is coming upstairs now. I don't think I have seen so fine a night this summer. There is a shifting mist on the marshes behind the sea-wall. The moonlight is shining through it, giving it the milky appearance of pearls. Pearls and diamonds. I suppose I can take this ring off now. I should like to throw it away. Tomorrow I think I shall throw it away. Into the sea, perhaps. Yes, into the sea. The end.